Welcome to the Nick Taylor Horror Show. Rodney Ascher is a filmmaker and one of the most unique and interesting documentarians working today. His career was kickstarted by an 8-minute doc short called The S from Hell. Side note, this film is awesome. It focuses on this bizarre phenomenon where an entire generation of children were terrified of a seemingly simple corporate logo animation sequence. The 1964 Screen Gems logo is considered as the scariest corporate logo in history. In the movie, we hear firsthand accounts of people who were terrified of the logo and its accompanying music, which was considered by many to be demonic. It's a great watch, and you can easily find it if you just Google The S from Hell. Anyway, next, Rodney directs perhaps his best-known documentary, Room 237, which focuses on the exhaustively diverse amount of theories surrounding The Shining. This is another fascinating watch. Rodney's other projects include The Nightmare, a terrifying doc about sleep paralysis, and the DUCE Tapes about the shocking frontman of the band The Mentors. His next documentary is A Glitch in the Matrix, which will focus on the idea of simulation theory. This is the belief that all of reality is a digital simulation similar to the Matrix. All of his work is extremely unique and transcends traditional documentary formats. By relying mostly on archival footage to move the narrative forward, hypnotic music, and really unique sound design, Rodney seems to create a palpably cerebral sensibility with his documentaries. They have a really overall cinematic and Kubrick-esque feel to them and are really great and unique watches. The common theme amongst all of his films, from what it seems, is the subjective human experiences, as his documentaries are less interested in being journalistic and investigative and more focused on gaining insights into the human condition through individual perspectives. He's a fascinating filmmaker who I really admire and am a huge fan of, and I enjoyed speaking with him a lot. Now, here, without further ado, is the great Rodney Ascher. Been following your career for a while, and I'm just wondering, from the perspective of breaking in, how did you find your way into making feature-length documentaries? What was essentially your big break, as it were?
Yeah, my big break was, I'd say it was a short film. I did a doc in, I think it was 2010, a short one, and I've been working on it probably for 2 years, to tell you the truth, The S from Hell.
Yeah.
And, at that point, I thought it was sort of a late film for me, not a beginning film, because, I was pushing 40 and I had a sort of stop and go career as like a music video and TV commercial director. And, had done 2 or 3 of those that I was happy with, but they were few and far between. And, previously I had worked as a storyboard artist and, camera assistant and different things on film shoots. And a couple of friends and I from film school, did a bunch of shorts together, like in the 90s. This would have been, just coming out of film school, and we were very into, punk rock and industrial music videos, and the work of, folks like, Richard Kern or, whoever was doing, like early 9 Inch Nails or like Skinny Puppy videos, things like, there's a group in Chicago, H-Gun, that was really inspirational to a lot of what we were doing. And, we had me and my friend Sid Guerin, did a Super 8 true crime, black and white prison film, with a all sock puppet cast. And that played around a little bit. Like the Chicago or the New York Underground Film Festivals. And at a certain point, the two of us went out to San Francisco and we're doing animation. He did this amazing movie with a friend of his, Eric Henry, an animated hip hop feature called Wave Twisters, which was so incredibly ahead of its time. And they got so deep into, matching, each note of music with animated flourish. But that thing was, I don't know how many years in the making, and I was trying to get more back into live action stuff, and rolled out into Los Angeles, and I took another stab at commercials and music videos, and I don't know if I need to go over the point by point, but it was a very long, circuitous path, right? And when I did the S from Hell, I had taken a day job teaching editing class at a film school out here. But, for some, insane reason, the S from Hell, which couldn't have been a more obscure, idiosyncratic project, just kind of broke wider than anything I'd ever done, and it, and played at Sundance, and, went on a pretty extensive festival tour, which it didn't connect me with anyone, who would, go so far as to finance anything, but it certainly was, it was a huge amount of encouragement at a point where I was pretty ready to give up, find a job teaching or in a post house or at an ad agency or, wherever I could find a place. But, because of, the success of the S from Hell, I was motivated to, try a feature, and and Room 237 was something that me and my friend, my producer Tim Kirk, were able to do like 90% of it on our own. So then when that one got into Sundance, that was 2 years later, and that was really, I think, that was when it became a career. And from, and it's, the kind of thing where if you're lucky enough, getting a movie into Sundance is a lottery ticket, and then getting it to continue to live after Sundance is a second lottery ticket. Getting it distributed is you're just in a nut, because so many, I've personally seen so many amazing movies at those festivals, who don't get that second strike of lightning.
Right.
And it isn't because of the quality of the film. There's 1,000 variables, and God knows, why it happens to one and not the other. But, 237, got picked up, and it both, it got me on tour where, I met, a ton of people that many of whom I'm still in touch with, and kind of introduced me to the festival community that I didn't really know beforehand, and, because of, again, like the S from Hell, it's a, insanely specific, idiosyncratic movie, and one that I never imagined was going to play in movie theaters. I thought it was a movie that was going to play, if I got lucky, it might play at a festival, but mostly it would play, at, art spaces,
right.
Places with, 50 folding metal chairs.
Nothing wrong with those places.
No, that's a circuit that I know and love, especially in San Francisco and Miami.
Yeah.
And I spent a ton of time when I lived in San Francisco at this place, Artist Television Access, run by Craig Baldwin, the experimental filmmaker who, his movies are astonishing found footage collages, but more than that, he's an amazing programmer, and there are nights where I'd see 2 or 3 hours of stuff that he would program together, new independent shorts and things from his archives. He still has, access to an incredible archives. And those screenings are very inspirational.
What was his name again?
To me, Craig Baldwin.
Okay.
He did features like Spectres from the Spectres of the Spectrum. He did a documentary about Negative Sonic Outlaws. He studied with and is really like an heir to Bruce Conner.
Okay.
His other movie, Tribulation 99, sort of the ultimate, insane UFO conspiracy mashup.
Right. Well, one thing...
And I'd say Craig and Bruce Conner, both in their own ways, were giant inspirations for me in the way that, the way that they would use archive.
Yeah, I feel like there's a real nuance to properly using archive to not only cut away to archive, but use archival footage to drive the narrative of a movie. And it obviously depends on the archival footage and the subject and all of that, but it seems like that's kind of that's a staple of their overall style, and it sounds like it's something that you've embraced as well. Is there any sort of art to utilizing archival footage that you attempt to utilize from a storytelling perspective? Because some documentarians can do it just in this very natural way, and other ones just kind of can't or don't.
Yeah, it's maybe a little bit of a challenge to articulate, but I think the most important thing is finding ways for it to be to use it in a way that's not exactly literal.
Mm-hmm.
That it isn't the narrator says, and we went to Paris and saw the Eiffel Tower, and you cut to the Eiffel Tower. There's the movie. There's Bruce Conner's movie called A Movie, which is one of the landmarks of found footage films. And he would just do simple things like, cutting from, a Navy, a sub commander looking through a periscope to like a bikini girl on a beach. And clearly that's not what he would literally be able to see. But,
right.
It's very, conceptually it's, almost like Soviet style montage, 1 + 1 = 3, that
right.
You connect different ideas and to create a third one. And I mean, maybe that example is almost literal, because you can imagine, they're on the water, she's nearby, but he would, he found ways, of using archive that feels like, I don't know, archetypes,
Mm-hmm.
which is, you get into, the dangerous waters of, pretension, when you start trying to describe this stuff with like Jungian
right.
vocabulary. But, often in those kind of movies, in the good ones, they find footage that doesn't feel like it's just, even if it's like they're reusing military footage, this soldier is not this one guy. He represents all soldiers throughout history, or
right.
He represents the United States of America,
Mm-hmm.
And somehow you're able to get that bigger idea that it's not just the specificity of whatever this thing originally was.
Yeah.
I know, I think I got my first exposure to that style of all things. Do you remember Down and Out in Beverly Hills?
Vaguely do. Yeah. I remember when it came out. I think I saw it. I don't remember it clearly.
Well, there's a sequence, I think it's Richard Dreyfuss and Bette Midler are, a upper class couple living in Beverly Hills, and Nick Nolte tries to drown himself in their pool. But the moment that really struck me in that is their teenage son aspires to be a filmmaker, and what he and the kind of filmmaker he is he's a found footage filmmaker, and again in the earlier use of the word, Bruce Conner, Craig Baldwin, even like William S. Burroughs cut-ups. He's talking about finding footage, not the Blair Witch Project.
Right.
An amazing movie, but a completely different beast.
Yeah,
a completely
different type
genre.
of found footage.
But so he would he'd say, "Dad, this is a video that I just made that expresses what's going on in my head." And it was, like a 20-second montage. It was something very simple. Again, there's probably like sexy girls dancing and nuclear bombs exploding and, Godzilla coming out of the ocean. And it was cut, super fast to, some, propulsive rock track. And, that kind of just struck a lightning bolt in my head, and I didn't want to go back to the regular movie after
right.
that. and Richard Dreyfuss kind of rolled his eyes and walked away from that video with a shrug. But I think it was very meaningful to me. And there's moments like that even in Clockwork Orange, when Alex is listening to music at the beginning of the movie and he sees visions of like the Roman columns falling and the statues in his room, they're cut like they're marching, and there's like cavemen who are, and it's reflecting these big emotional states that are flying through his brain. I'd assume that Kubrick was drawing from some of the 60s era experimental filmmakers, but it's a very exciting moment in that movie, and not necessarily the first place, one of the first things that you think of. Of course, this has been a fairly substantial digression, but
no, I'm with
movies at a place like Other Cinema in San Francisco. I mean, that's where I thought 237 was going to play, in the same venue where I would see old VHS tapes of 60s experimental filmmakers or strange college students.
Cool. Yeah, I feel like the most kind of blatantly over-the-top vulgar expression of that style that you're describing is probably all of Natural Born Killers, where it's just cutaway after cutaway after cutaway. But I think that's what makes the movie so interesting, gives it its energy. One thing I find particularly interesting about your style, and I mean, let's note the fact that as we're talking about inspirations for you as a documentarian, you've mostly mentioned narratives. And what I was going to say is your documentaries are extremely cinematic, and I would imagine that the majority of inspiration that you've gotten for your films have not come from other documentaries, but have come from fictional films. Is that accurate?
It is. I mean, I have. And I'd never set out to be, a documentary filmmaker. But The S from Hell was sort of a documentary. Yeah. And actually, before it, there was a feature that I had attempted and abandoned that I was calling The Collectors, which would have been, just interviews with, sort of obsessively focused collectors of most anything, and trying to understand, what kind of drives that, what drives that energy, and it kind of fell apart.
Didn't they turn that into a TV show called Hoarders? I'm kidding.
Hoarders? Yeah, no, well, I've only been able to bear. I've never seen an episode of Hoarders all the way through.
It's tough. It's tough to get through.
But it is a fine. But it's I struggle with that stuff myself, and one of the things. One of the questions I was hoping to ask is, where do you draw the line between being a collector and being a hoarder? And sometimes it's just about how much shelf space, if you have enough shelf space for everything.
Yeah, there's a part of the George Lucas documentary, The People versus George Lucas, that gets into just the obsessive Star Wars collector fandom mentality, and it's crazy. People spend all of their life savings on action figures. So that dove a little into it, but it sounds like a fascinating topic.
Yeah, there's a couple of shorts that I kind of spun it into, but I was never able to get the full feature together. But I mean, if a lot of my inspiration is from narrative or experimental films. I wouldn't say none is documentary, and like anyone, Errol Morris was certainly Errol Morris is a much bigger inspiration to me than Michael Moore. And like The Thin Blue Line is certainly a movie that again was another lightning bolt, and I've heard him describe what made the reenactments that he was doing in that film so special, and what was amazing and cinematic about them was, again, he wasn't just cutting to the Eiffel Tower when someone mentioned it. He was filming things that people claimed to have seen, that he wasn't, and though he wasn't sure whether or not they were telling the truth. And I think it was almost the exercise of, like, as he describes that shooting and the witnesses, and then by adding each witness's layer to the previous. He would return to the reenactment and add another card and another witness and another until revealing, ultimately the absurdity of some of them.
Right.
And that was really unbelievable to me. And there was a film, it was like a year and a half ago, maybe now, that Penny Lane did, that I really loved. I'm blanking on the title, but
I think I know the one you're talking about.
It was called The Pain of Others.
Oh, I didn't see that.
And that one really pushes the definition of documentary. I mean, the film is a collection of YouTube videos of people who are sort of describing their battles with a disease that the MDA has, is not sure whether or not it's real or whether it's psychosomatic. And so the videos themselves are kind of harrowing, and it really pushes the definition because in some ways it's a found footage film.
Right.
She didn't interview these people. She didn't film them, but by finding them and putting them in this context and the intercuts that she made, it's an incredibly powerful movie, and it really pushes questions about, what is a documentary? Right. And I mean, maybe one of the more exciting things about the genre these days is it's very open to interpretation. It's very open to like stretching the format. Yeah. I think, maybe more so than narrative right now.
Yeah, it feels like documentaries are having a heyday nowadays. It seems like interest in them has gone up substantially. And I feel like part of that is what you just touched on, the fact that the format, it's not as cut and dry as it once was. And there's a lot more room for experimentation. It feels that way anyway.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that, is kind of interesting about it. I mean, I ultimately, am drawn to filmmaking as a way of making something. I don't necessarily, nothing against Michael Moore, but in some ways I think he's more of a journalist,
right,
than I kind of feel. I'm trying to, it feels like he's breaking a story, and he's writing he's writing his essay, but I'm kind of trying to, make a thing.
Yeah, and if your documentaries feel way more exploratory. And I remember you saying in another interview that you never approach a documentary with the ending in mind. In other words, you allow the story to kind of unfold naturally. So I was curious as to how do you, in terms of like if there's any sort of script equivalent or deliverable that you begin a project with, how, if you don't necessarily know how the story is going to end, what do you prep ahead of time to kind of get you in the right mindset to follow that story?
Well, I don't know how other people work, and I can't really imagine a documentary that knows how it's going to end, unless, I don't know, maybe you're doing a story, you're doing a story about World War II, but even then,
right,
you'd be surprises. Yeah. The process for right now, I'm working on one. Like I did one with a friend that we played last year, which was kind of different from some of the others, but. This one I'm working on now is very much the same. It looks very different from The Nightmare or 237, but it's the same workflow. Mm-hmm. Which is to say, the first step is thinking of these are all going to be made voiceover interviews with a group of folks, and it's like how to find. What category of people do I want to talk to? And there's a little bit of casting, that goes into that. Like in The Nightmare, I know I only wanted to talk to people who had these, sort of intense, extreme episodes of sleep paralysis. Mm-hmm. Quick thing I wanted to mention before I forgot, before continuing on the thread I was on. I'd say another documentarian whose work I find incredibly inspirational and is absolutely, inspirational in my own work is Brett Morgan.
Okay, cool.
So, like the kid stays in the picture, was a really big movie for me, both because of actually the technique itself, with the still images that were animated.
Yeah.
Coincidentally, it was something that me and Sid and some of our crew had been experimenting with on our own. So we were kind of astonished to see it. Somebody else had done it and better, and in a whole movie.
So that's interesting.
I also just loved the way that this movie was presented as, a funhouse ride into Robert Evans' head.
Yeah, and it was his perspective only.
His perspective only, and so anything that you didn't believe goes to your understanding of him as a character.
Right. Yeah, I loved that too. Because I feel like a lot of documentarians feel obligated to show multiple sides of a person in pursuit of the truth, which obviously is admirable. But sometimes you just want something that's character-driven. And I felt like that was indulgently wonderful in that regard. It was just pure Bob Evans, which I think made it great.
I thought it was totally great. And Jane was an unbelievable movie. Again, a very single point of view, and the way that he took sort of the National Geographic aesthetic that, like, I know from 1,000 magazine covers, and just kind of expanded it and worked it and turned it into a psychedelic rock concert. That movie was amazing, and he really takes his time to make his documentaries these complete sight and sound experiences, which is something I aspire to.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference when you have interesting elements beyond the talking heads, beyond just the storytelling. What was that one called? The Devil, and Daniel Johnston, I thought, did a beautiful job at illustrating all of his archival stuff, and just having all those extra elements that contribute to the storytelling without distracting from it, I think is, I feel like that's what a lot of documentarians of the future need to remember to do. Otherwise, the usual formats can just kind of get old and tiresome after a while. But yeah, I'm always inspired by how documentarians tell their stories other than the talking heads.
It's a pretty big pool, and there's room for, in different stories demand, different approaches. I do love fly on the wall films, though I don't know that I'd ever be able to do one.
Yeah.
I think the favorite for me is Demon Lover Diary.
I have not seen that.
Well, it's a pretty difficult film to see these days. It's Joel Krenz, I think her name is. She was a real hardcore kind of direct cinema documentarian, and her boyfriend got the job shooting as DP on a low budget horror movie.
Okay.
And the caveat was he would do it for free if she could come along and shoot an all access behind the scenes documentary. And it's very rigorously
like Hearts of Darkness.
Yeah, but there's, it's even more. It's like the approach is is much more raw and dry, and it's a little bit like American Movie, only it's 100 times better because in Demon Lover Diary, the documentary crew and the horror crew despise each other.
That's always fun.
And it is tense and horrifying and hilarious, from the beginning to the end.
Oh wow!
It's hard to see because they only want to show. They only like to show it. They're the kind of folks who say this is a film. This is meant to be seen on film. This is not a video. This is not a TV show.
Yeah.
So you have to catch like a festival screening. I was lucky enough to see it.
Oh, so it's not available for the masses?
In San Francisco. There's no commercial release that I know of.
Oh, all right. That's a shame that it's not available.
Yeah, I'd love to see a Criterion set with that. And,
yeah, that would be cool.
A double box with that and Demon Lover, a.k.a. Coven, the movie they were covering.
Right. No, that would be super cool.
And the horror movie itself is like, well, when you see the documentary, you'll be amazed that that the horror feature actually got finished. But the
Oh, wow.
one thing that's interesting about low budget movies, a lot of location shooting, in non-professional actors, and there's a scene in a bar with some local cover band playing. There's a huge amount of documentary value even in the feature. But this is what Detroit was like in 1978 or whenever they were filming.
Oh, so it gives a good kind of it acts as a time capsule for Detroit during that time period in a way.
Yeah, absolutely.
That sounds cool. Yeah, I gotta dig that out. I'm sure it's got to be somewhere on the internet.
It's a spoiler, but they get chased off the set at the end of the film at gunpoint.
Oh my God! I'm dying to see this.
Unbelievable.
Wow, it does sound like a really just angry version of American movie.
Yeah, they don't think he's a charming. They don't think he's a charming, idiosyncratic dude that they wish the best for. They loathe and despise each other. It's amazing.
I'm going to search high and wide for this. This sounds awesome. So when you approach a project or consider a project, what is your litmus test for whether or not you're going to pursue it? I'm sure you have tons of ideas, but is there any sort of either ritual or litmus test you put ideas through to determine I'm going to dedicate the next couple of years of my life to making this, to telling this story? How do you figure out what to pursue?
Well, there's what to pursue, and then there's what you can get made. Because after 237, the 237 was a movie that me and Tim did, on our own time, without any schedule or budget. But the Nightmare got financed, and there was a real team behind it, and the same with the one I'm working on now. So it's both. So the two things are, it's an idea that I have to still be kind of stuck on and obsessing with, for over a year or so, because typically, with these last couple, I've just kind of vaguely been thinking about things and kind of casually researching them for like a year and a half before sitting down and making a treatment and trying to get it made. So it's that combination of something that an idea that I can't put down that I'm still interested in, but also that I'm successfully able to convince someone else to produce.
Got it. So one thing I'm always fascinated with about art directors and artists of all kinds is, what is your kind of collection process like? In other words, a lot of directors, they keep these kind of photo books of ideas and concepts and images that they see that can inspire certain things. They kind of keep track of tones and ideas and concepts in different ways. And some people have this digitally with mixes of images and video and stuff in one place. Do you have any sort of collection process just for things that reflect the tone that you want to go with, or certain conceptual visual notes or things of that nature?
Well, depending on how you mean, I'm not a super focused one. As far as like my book and movie collection, it's mostly just things that I like and I find fascinating. But what I do before really starting into a project is I kind of make an inspiration reel, right? And it's as much for me to find the stuff that I like and the stuff and see what I don't. But then I also share it with, the people I'm working with. Like for the Nightmare, I had a 90-minute long, inspiration reel that I forced most of the crew to watch with me. That were clips of things that related in one way or the other. Like it might have reflected the art direction, or just the attitude, or even distinctly, or even as concretely as the subject matter. And I did it, for the new one too. And I pitched, and I've similarly I've pitched projects that I haven't gotten. But, typically I've gone into the room with, a 3 or 4 minute reel of, inspiration stuff and other clips that I, assemble from, in my collection or I find online or wherever, and put them to a music track, that does a lot of the heavy lifting. Luckily a lot of them stay on a drive, but I'm not, actively researching, that kind of stuff, with any kind of focus or plan.
Right. Your films feel the tone is very, very well handcrafted. It feels, the tone of each movie feels very specific and also very, very unique.
From 237 on, I've had the luck, of working with Jonathan Snipes, the composer, and his contribution to the attitude, the tone, and the feeling of the films, can't be overstated. The funny thing is, after 237, when I was working on The Nightmare, I used a lot of cues from 237, in the rough cut as I was working on it. And then when I did Primal Scream, I used cues from 237 in The Nightmare. And,
interesting.
And now that I'm working, on A Glitch in the Matrix, I'm using. There's some other stuff, and he gave me he gave me a folder with a lot of other tracks that he thought might be in that might be in the direction we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say half of the temp tracks in the cut I'm working on now are the stuff that he did for my other projects.
Oh wow, that's cool.
His music just reflects the the feeling I'm going for just so perfectly.
Yeah. Well, that's great to have such a key collaborator who you just have a shorthand with like that.
Yeah, no, I feel really lucky that we were able to hook up on 237. And his band is really blowing up. If you heard Clipping.
No, is that the name of his band? Is Clipping?
Yeah, it's a hip hop band.
Oh wow.
When Daveed Diggs is the vocalist, and he was the vocalist before he won a Tony for Hamilton.
Oh wow. Oh, that sounds like an all-star band. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, it's Jonathan and Bill. They did 237 together, and Daveed, and it's such an astonishingly sculpted wall of sound.
Oh, wow.
They're on Spotify. Yeah, they'll blow your eardrums.
I'm looking forward to it. It sounds great. Cool. So I know it's early, but what can you tell us about A Glitch in the Matrix? I mean, I read the overall synopsis of it. I mean, it sounds really, really fascinating. How did you first of all, do you mind just giving your 2-sentence or however long description of the concept behind it? Because I'll probably butcher it if I attempt to explain it.
Well, the subject, it's a film about, people who believe that we're living in a digital simulation, more or less like the Matrix. Mm-hmm. And it was an exciting idea for me because it's kind of, I wonder if it might be the end of this cycle, because 237 and The Nightmare are very much about, sort of the subjective experiences and people who look at things maybe differently than you or I do. And we go from looking at film, music, art, etc. in 237 to this dreamlike experience in The Nightmare to the entire world in this one. And I was pretty late to the game. I only really got discovered the idea of simulation theory while I was working on The Nightmare, and it turned out that a person I was interviewing for that film told me off camera that what they thought the sort of shadowy entities that they saw during sleep paralysis were the people outside the simulation.
Like the agents.
Yeah. Or like the people in Dark City. I forget what they're called. Who rearrange furniture while you're asleep.
Right. Yeah.
Or there's a VR experience that I did with my kid here called The Void, where you put on goggles and a whole vest, and you kind of move through a maze. That's when it has a VR environment mapped over it. It's got like a Star Wars one and a Ralph one. And
I did the Ghostbusters one.
Yeah, okay. I think there's a really interesting, kind of metaphor of, the people who are in the maze, the people who work there who don't have the helmet on.
Right.
The equivalent of those people in our world.
Right.
So that kind of that got me on. So that put me on the track. But it was also, and I think I liked it for the same reason that, like, I found sleep paralysis, really interesting. I had, a few bouts of sleep paralysis, and saw, and saw a pretty horrifying shadow person.
Wow.
But this one, I guess, in a way, maybe there's a little bit more. Perhaps it's less personal because, previous to the film, I had never gotten really caught up in the question of, is this world fake? Are we living in a digital creation? But it feels like it feels like the next layer out, from the previous projects, and it's going to look entirely different from. I'd love for as much of it to be a surprise as possible when we premiere, but it is not going to look anything like it's not going to look anything like The Nightmare or 237, but I think you've recognized the tone.
Okay, cool. I can't wait. Is any idea when it's going to be out?
I think we'll be able to premiere this year.
Oh, that's great. Very cool. Is there any sort of, some people, when it comes to making documentaries, have actual scripts that they write out just to kind of have some semblance of a story guide?
Yeah.
What do you prepare when you're coming up with a doc?
I do it. Mine is the opposite. What we do is, I do kind of figure out the aspects of the story that I find interesting, right? Mm-hmm. So, like in The Nightmare, I'd say, from my own experience and from what I've read other people's accounts of sleep paralysis, I wanted someone who had an experience where there's someone else in the same room who had it at the same time. Because I'd heard a couple of those, and that seems to go a long way towards saying maybe this is something real and not just a hallucination.
Right.
Right, and I wanted someone who had it a long time over the course of years. And I wanted someone who had sort of a religious explanation for what was going on, so that kind of thing, so I had sort of a bullet list of, maybe a dozen or so threads and ideas, that I was hoping to find people that'd be able to talk, who'd be able to talk about that stuff. So when we started, figuring out who we wanted to talk to, it'd be like, oh, okay, here's somebody who had, had that double experience. Here's somebody who's had it ever since they were a kid, and it happens all the time. Here's somebody who it happened this way, or they believe this, or they believe that.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of casting up front, as a way of, because like when I was reading up on simulation theory, I have pages and pages of different ideas that it's related to, that I didn't want to read this out in voiceover, but I was trying to find someone who had an experience that would get them to talk about that aspect of it. So that's the closest thing to a script at the top of it, and there was a discussion of, how's this going to look like? What have we got? Like, The Nightmare very early on, it was, we're going to do, dramatic. We're going to do filmed reenactments. Although it wasn't until, the midpoint when we decided to do them in that all in a stage in that particular way. So the casting is this, finding people who can speak to different aspects of the story, is the big thing that we do at the top, and then have kind of a general notion of how we're going to bring this story to life. Right? 237 is all archives. The Nightmare is mostly reenactments, and we would interview people at night. Matrix, you will have to see, but it's a different approach. It's a different approach. So from there, what I do is, try to do those interviews as quickly as we can with as many people as we can. Then if I interview somebody for 2 hours, me and sometimes I have a partner. I had a co-editor on this one. We'd kind of listen to the interview and say, all right, this person, talked for 2 hours. Here's the 4 or 5 interesting things they said. Mm-hmm. And we would cut like a little 2 or 3 minute sequence for each of those things. Right. So now in my, editing desktop, it says Nick, and then there's, in the folder, there's 6 little sequences that are each a couple minutes long of talking about different aspects that each get a title. Mm-hmm. And we just grind out as much of that as we can for a long time. And we go as far as putting temp music and intercutting some B-roll into that, so that each of these pieces are kind of watchable and kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. And then it's, sort of the closest thing to a script is, put those all on little Post-it notes, and if there's 15 people who each have 9 things they had to say, I don't know, like 150 or 120 little squares we get. Mm-hmm. And then it's arranging them into finding connections, arranging them into clumps, and then chapters. So then at the end of it, we'll probably use 30% of all those, sequences that were kind of roughed together. Yeah. And it's only in that stage where a sequence starts to appear. And sometimes somebody says something. And that's actually just happened all 3 times. Like in 237, when John Fell Ryan said, and it's weird because I'm living in this house and there's a big staircase and we're getting ready to move across the country, and I feel like I'm slowly turning into Jack Torrance.
Right.
I think when he said that, I knew that was almost certainly going to be the ending. Yeah. That somebody turning into Jack Torrance because of, possibly because of how much time they spent thinking about The Shining, is a very interesting ending, and it's a much more interesting ending to me than this is what The Shining means. Right. Right? And in The Nightmare, Chris says, I think because of, these problems I have, breathing while I'm sleeping, during sleep paralysis, that I might die because of this. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, I wouldn't get rid of it if I could, because it's given me a glimpse beyond the veil. It's allowed me to see things that other people don't say, that other people can't see. Yeah. And the moment I heard him say that, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's probably the ending. Yeah. Yeah, I was like, wow, that's heavy. And I was hoping that I was going to be able to do just almost like a 2-minute single take, just shot of his head saying all that, in a way of defaulting to a very, very standard, unaffected documentary quality for the ending. But it wound up not working exactly like that at the end of the day. And in this one, somebody said something that at the end I said, that's a pretty cool, that could be a pretty cool ending. So that happens, and you remember that, no matter everything else that you do, and then you play it back, and then however long it takes to get that sequence cut, you say, was that as good as I thought? Did that have as big of an impact? And I have to say, I had to give credit to Ross Dinnerstein, who produced The Nightmare in this one, that he gave me enough rope to do that, and to figure out what this movie was going, because early on I was like, this is the subject. These are the kind of stories I'm hoping I can find people to tell. Here's an idea for what it might look like, but that's going to evolve as we find out what the stories are and what people say, and there was enough of a trust and confidence to let us figure it out as we went along.
So the endings just sort of present themselves.
Well, everything.
Everything does. Yeah, it's fascinating that you kind of do a pre-edit in a very tangible way with physical Post-its, and I'm assuming you're doing it all on a whiteboard and things like that. I mean, just in this age of digital technology, I mean, I personally have to think through certain things that way, particularly when you're making connections between different potential details and narrative arcs and things like that. It seems like that can, with certain people on a certain level, that can only be done with physical, tangible cards because you have to mix things around and move things. Is that a big part of your process, is doing things by hand?
Yeah, well, I mean, this one in particular is a very digital project, but like that kind of thinking, that kind of big picture thinking can only be done that way. I mean, I suppose, Tom Cruise, Minority Report computers, you could do it that way. But you still see him like waving his arms. Right. Physical kind of a thing. But just to be able to see that much stuff and to be very quickly be able to move it around. Yeah. Hypothetically, it'd be possible in some 7-8 foot long computer screen that's touch sensitive, but I don't know if that'd be easier and quicker.
I got it.
But yeah, I mean, because that's, for me, that's been one of the bigger efforts in all these projects has been to find that the through line, right? To discard, and there's a lot of pain in discarding things that are really cool and really interesting, but block the pathway between A and B, and then an opportunity to find and then they don't find another path. They don't find another slot on the stream where they fit. And I think because the way I kind of picture these is that they're not the final statements. They're on these subjects. There's plenty more scholarship to be done about The Shining. Right. There's a lot, and there's a lot of more complicated aspects of sleep paralysis that I don't feel an obligation to get every idea about the subject in there. These don't have to be the Wikipedia articles about the subjects. This is more about capturing what the atmosphere of what it's like to be kind of stuck inside them. Yeah,
and I feel like that is a pitfall that a lot of documentarians accidentally fall into, is they feel like their documentary has to be the end-all, be-all depiction of a certain topic, when in fact it's way more interesting if it's either through a particular perspective or if it's character-driven or like that. But to take that pressure off yourself to say, this doesn't have to be everything that needs to be said on the topic of X, Y, or Z, that's got to just enable you to be able to see and discover the really compelling elements of your project, as opposed to just getting caught up in being comprehensive.
No, that's the plan anyway.
Yeah. Well, last few questions here. So obviously when it comes to directing and filmmaking, there's a lot of resources and books on the topic, and a lot of them are known to be done by people who haven't actually done what they're writing about. But that being said, were there any resources or books that were particularly formidable for you as an artist or as a filmmaker, either from the perspective of establishing your creative process or learning about the business? Was there anything that was particularly helpful for you in any regard when it comes to filmmaking that you'd recommend?
Yeah, there's a couple, not a ton. Walter Murch's book, I think it's In the Blink of an Eye.
Yeah, that's a great one.
About editing theory. And he and it's, and it's great because it's not about, it's not about the technical. It's about, what is editing? It's about editing as a language, and what does it mean? That's a really good one. David Mamet has a couple of books. I don't know that I've ever been able to really implement his advice, but I've found his directing film and on writing books to be pretty super sharp.
Okay, great.
I used to be a storyboard artist, and I still kind of do scrawly storyboards for my stuff. I don't have the book here, but there was a book that was describing itself as a directing book, but it was actually really a good prep to storyboards called, I think it's Directing Shot by Shot, I think. And it's just full of great illustrations of here's how to frame 5 people in one conversation. Kind of a thing, which, until you sat down and you said, all right, we've got 5 people talking, where do I put them and where do I put the camera? It has,
that sounds helpful.
Great examples of that. Yeah. Filmmaking Shot by Shot, I think it's called. I believe the writer's first name is Steven. And then I might say that, what was it? Red Letter Media's feature-length review of the Star Wars prequels.
Ooh, really?
They did amazing things about kind of focusing on what's important. I like the prequels more than they do, more than those guys did.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of interesting ideas in them.
Okay.
But there's a piece in there where they break away and they interview their friends and they say, without describing what they look like or what their job is in the movie, describe these Star Wars characters. And they say Han Solo, and somebody says, "Oh, he's a smart aleck and he's mischievous. He's generally a nice guy, but he wants you to think he's a badass." And they go on and on and on and on. Then they say, Qui-Gon Jinn. It's like, who? Liam Neeson in the Phantom Menace. Oh, Stoic? Queen Amidala. Oh, well, she's got that lips. Don't tell me what she looks like. It was a very really potent reminder about about character.
Yeah.
Here's the filmmaking book. It's called Film Directing Shot by Shot by Stephen Katz.
Okay, I'll check that out.
Oh, I might also suggest Shock Value by John Waters.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
That's good. I like to flatter myself. When I was in school, that I was pretty punk rock. So John Waters was an early hero.
Nice. Was there anything that you wish you knew going into your first feature that would have saved you a significant amount of time, heartache, or capital? Anything, any rookie errors that aspiring documentarians or filmmakers should be aware of that you wish you knew ahead of time?
Well, I would go back to the collectors. In 2 through 7, sort of made it sort of sense. I was able to get my head around what we were doing pretty quickly. But the collectors collapsed because I didn't really know what it wanted to be about, and the topic was too wide. Yeah, this is going to tell everything about every kind of collector in the world, and at a certain point, after I had a half dozen, kind of interesting interviews, I just got sort of paralyzed by how many choices or how these were all going to go together. They didn't really go together in any normal way.
Last question. So, you, other than documentaries, you moved on to some narratives like Haunted, Horrifying Sounds from Beyond the Grave. What are you working on next? Are you going to stick with documentaries? Are you going to do some narrative fiction? What would you like to do next?
I'd love to. My ambition would be to do narrative fiction after this. But I'm exploring documentary as well. I'm hoping that I don't need to choose between the two. But but no, I'm absolutely interested in in doing some more straightforward narrative projects as well.
Got it.
Maybe not completely straightforward.
Do you want to stick in the kind of horror genre?
Most likely horror, science fiction. Those are still the films that really capture my imagination for the most part. Yeah.
Okay, well, cool. Rodney, this is a real pleasure. Like I said, I've been an admirer of your work for a long time, so this is a tremendous honor. Thank you for taking the time. This was great.
Thanks, Nick. I appreciate that.
All right, so here as always are some key takeaways from this conversation with Rodney Ascher. Number 1, don't try to make the end-all be-all documentary on a topic. Rodney's films have a very particular and unique style and tone, and his signature as a director is very recognizable and unique. His films are some of the most cinematically interesting documentaries ever made. One of the reasons he's able to have such a clear voice and vision as a documentarian is that Rodney is unencumbered by the obligation to be clinically comprehensive. In other words, Rodney's less interested in being journalistic and attempting to exhaustively cover every single detail about his topics. No, instead he picks a particular perspective and follows that instead. This kind of focus can make for a compelling and subjective documentary, as opposed to one that feels like a Wikipedia article. Number 2, create story reels to establish the tone of your movie. This goes for documentarians and filmmakers of all kinds. Film is such a visual and tone-specific medium. It's critically important to be able to be a visual communicator to all of the many people you'll collaborate with. One of the best ways to communicate your vision behind your film is to create video reels. Video reels are comprised of clips, segments, music, and tonal references edited together that reflect elements that you want to emulate in your project. Obviously, this means that you'll need to learn how to edit. Rodney spoke about how he would create feature-length reels with selections from multiple films and pieces of footage that he would review with his editors and DP to make sure everyone was making the same movie. This is a great tip to keep everybody on the same page and in line with your vision. Number 3, edit by hand. When he's putting together his films, Rodney distills all of the sound bites, scenes, and themes into tons of Post-it notes and then groups them into clumps by hand to find the commonalities and connections between ideas. Films typically are the brilliant assembly of a number of seemingly disparate parts. It's the way that you connect the dots and artfully impart your point of view that truly makes you a director. With so many elements that have to come together, the process of editing by hand can enable certain connections and breakthroughs between different ideas that simply can't happen digitally. Maybe they can. But for some people, me included, the ability to pick up note cards and shuffle them around can be extremely helpful in making connections, discovering through lines, and ultimately discovering your movie. Anyway, guys, thank you again as always for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean the world to me if you shared it with your friends and family on social media. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and wherever you listen. And thanks again for listening to the Nick Taylor Horror Show.